The candles glow. Picture this, if you will. It is twilight in Philadelphia, 1787. The summer air hangs thick and heavy, carrying the scent of horse leather and printing ink through narrow cobblestone streets. Through tall windows of Independence Hall, candlelight flickers against weathered faces, faces etched with worry, hope, and the weight of an impossible dream. These men have gathered not just to talk, but to birth a nation from nothing more than ideas and ink. In this room, destiny whispers through quill scratches on parchment. But tonight, as shadows dance across their determined faces, none of them truly knows the magnitude of what they're creating. They cannot see the future presidents who will emerge from their ranks, 7 men who will shape not just a country, but the very soul of what it means to lead. This is their story, a story that begins not with victory, but with doubt, not with certainty, but with faith, not with kings and crowns, but with farmers and philosophers who dared to believe that ordinary people could govern themselves. Close your eyes and let us journey back to where it all began, to understand how 7 very different men, each carrying their own dreams, fears, and flaws, would build the foundation upon which a nation would stand for centuries to come. Chapter 1. The Reluctant Giant. George Washington, 1789 to 1797. The Weight of a Name. The morning of April 30th, 1789, dawned gray and uncertain over New York Harbor. George Washington stood at the window of his temporary residence, his large hands clasped behind his back, watching ships bob gently in the harbor below. At 57, his hair had silvered and his face bore the lines of a man who had seen war, loss, and the terrible burden of other people's hopes. In just a few hours, he would place his hand upon a Bible and speak words that had never been spoken before in human history, not to inherit a throne, but to accept a responsibility that no man had ever held before. He would become the first president of the United States of America. But on this morning, in the quiet before the storm of ceremony, Washington felt the familiar weight of doubt settling on his shoulders like an old, unwelcome friend. He had been here before, standing at the edge of the impossible, asked to do what no one had ever done before. The room around him smelled of beeswax candles and fresh ink from the letters scattered across his desk. Each letter bore the hopes and fears of a young nation. Some begged him to be strong, to rule with an iron fist. Others pleaded with him to be gentle, to remember that they had just thrown off one king and had no desire for another. Washington reached into his waistcoat pocket and withdrew a small, worn piece of paper, a letter from his beloved Martha, written during the darkest days at Valley Forge. Her words, faded now, but still clear, reminded him of why he had chosen service over comfort, duty over desire, again and again. "My dearest husband," the letter began, "I know you carry the weight of every soldier's life, every family's hope. But remember, you also carry their love, their trust in your goodness. That is not a burden, my darling. It is a gift." He folded the letter carefully and placed it back in his pocket. Outside, bells were beginning to ring across the city. It was time. The boy who lost his father. To understand the man who would become America's first president, we must travel back in time to a small plantation in colonial Virginia, where a boy of 11 stood in the February cold, watching workers lower his father's coffin into the red clay earth. Augustine Washington had died suddenly in 1743, leaving behind a widow, 6 children, and debts that would reshape young George's entire future. The boy who might have been sent to England for education, as his older half-brothers had been, now faced a different destiny. The family plantation at Ferry Farm would become both his schoolroom and his prison, teaching him lessons that no English boarding school ever could. In the months after his father's death, George discovered something remarkable about himself. He was happiest when he was moving, exploring, pushing beyond the boundaries of what he knew. While his peers studied Latin and Greek, George learned to read the landscape. The way morning mist clung to river valleys, the patterns that revealed where game would travel, the subtle signs that meant the difference between a good tobacco harvest and ruin. His mother, Mary Ball Washington, was a woman of iron will wrapped in velvet gloves. She taught George that a man's word was his bond, that duty came before desire, and that true strength revealed itself not in how loudly one could shout, but in how steadily one could stand when the winds of crisis threatened to knock everyone else down. George, she would tell him as they walked the boundaries of their land, remember that leadership is not something you take. It is something that others give to you. And they give it only when they trust that you will use it not for yourself, but for them. These words would echo through his mind decades later, as he faced decisions that would determine whether a newborn nation would thrive or crumble. The surveyor's compass. At 16, George Washington stood at a crossroads, literally and figuratively. Before him stretched the vast wilderness of Virginia's North Neck, unmarked and unmeasured. In his hands he held a surveyor's compass, its brass surface gleaming in the early morning sun. This was not the life his father had envisioned for him. Augustine Washington had dreamed of sending his son to England, of George taking his place among Virginia's plantation elite through education and refinement. But death had rewritten those plans, and now the boy found himself with a different kind of education entirely. Lord Fairfax, one of the wealthiest men in colonial America, had given George an extraordinary opportunity to survey his vast holdings beyond the Blue Ridge Mountains. It was dangerous work. The frontier was home to wild animals, unpredictable weather, and the ever-present possibility of conflict with Native American tribes. But for a young man hungry to prove himself, it was perfect. The wilderness taught Washington lessons that would prove invaluable decades later when he commanded armies and led a nation. He learned patience, how to wait out storms that could last for days, how to track game across terrain that seemed impossible to navigate. He learned resilience, how to sleep on the ground, eat whatever food he could find, and push forward even when his body screamed for rest. Most importantly, he learned leadership. The surveying teams included men twice his age, hardened frontiersmen who had little patience for the commands of a wealthy planter's son. Washington quickly discovered that his authority came not from his last name or his social position, but from his willingness to work harder than anyone else, to take the greatest risks, and to always keep his word. One evening, camped beside a creek that would later bear his name, Washington sat by the fire and wrote in his journal, "I have learned that the wilderness respects no man's birth, only his character. It strips away all pretense and reveals what truly lies in a man's heart. I pray that what lies in mine is worthy of the trust others place in it." The young colonel's baptism. The year 1754 found 22-year-old George Washington in a place no young man should ever find himself. Alone in a forest clearing, surrounded by the bodies of French soldiers, with the weight of starting a world war on his shoulders. It had begun simply enough. Virginia's governor had sent Washington to deliver a message to French forces in the Ohio Valley, leave British territory or face the consequences. But simple messages have a way of becoming complicated when young men carry them, and what was meant to be a diplomatic mission had exploded into violence at a place called Jumonville Glen. Washington stood in the aftermath, his uniform splattered with mud and blood, watching the smoke rise from the makeshift fort his men had hastily constructed. They had named it Fort Necessity, and never had a name been more prophetic. The French and their Native American allies were coming, and Washington's small force was outnumbered 5-1. The rain began to fall as Washington walked among his men, Virginia militiamen, most no older than himself, all looking to him for answers he didn't have. Their faces were young and frightened, and in their eyes he saw a reflection of his own fear. This was leadership stripped to its essence, not the ceremonial leadership of drawing rooms and state dinners, but the raw, terrifying responsibility of holding other people's lives in your hands when everything depends on the choices you make in the next few minutes. The Battle of Fort Necessity was a disaster. Washington was forced to surrender, signing documents in French that he couldn't read, documents that would later be used to justify a global war. His men were allowed to march away with their weapons, but Washington's reputation seemed shattered. Yet in that defeat, something crucial was forged. Washington learned that leadership wasn't about never failing, it was about how you responded to failure. The young colonel who rode back to Virginia was different from the one who had ridden out. He had been tested by fire and had not broken. He had faced his own mortality and the possibility of letting others down, and he had survived both. In his tent that final night at Fort Necessity, as rain drummed against the canvas and his men slept fitfully around him, Washington wrote a letter to his mother. I have learned that true courage is not the absence of fear, but action in spite of fear. I failed today, but I did not run. I stood with my men, and they stood with me. Perhaps that is enough for now. The revolutionary's burden. By the time the Continental Congress offered George Washington command of the Continental Army in 1775, he had learned the most important lesson of his life. Leadership was not a privilege to be enjoyed, but a burden to be carried. He accepted the position with characteristic reluctance, telling the delegates, "I do not think myself equal to the command I am honored with." But private letters to Martha revealed the true depth of his anguish. "I have been called upon to lead men into a war that we may very well lose against the most powerful nation on earth. The responsibility terrifies me, but I will not let fear make my choices for me."
The early years of the Revolution tested Washington in ways that would have broken lesser men. His army was poorly trained, inadequately supplied, and constantly deserting. British forces outnumbered him at every turn, and his own Continental Congress seemed more interested in political maneuvering than in providing the support his men desperately needed. The winter at Valley Forge became the crucible in which Washington's leadership was truly forged. As snow fell on the makeshift huts that sheltered his army, as men left bloody footprints in the snow because they had no shoes, as the daily death toll from disease and exposure mounted, Washington faced the darkest moments of his life. Every morning he walked through the camp, speaking with soldiers who had given up everything to follow him. He knew their names, their families, their fears, and when they looked at him, he saw not just their trust, but their desperation. They needed him to be strong when he felt weak, confident when he was terrified, hopeful when hope seemed impossible. In his private quarters, a small room in a stone farmhouse, Washington would sit each evening and write letters. Letters to Martha, pouring out his doubts and fears. Letters to Congress, begging for supplies and reinforcements. Letters to his officers, trying to keep their spirits up even as his own flagged. But it was a letter he never sent that revealed the true measure of the man. Found years later among his papers, it was addressed to no one, written in the depths of that terrible winter. I wonder sometimes if I am asking too much of these men, if their sacrifice will be worth the cause for which they suffer. Then I see them in the morning, gaunt and ragged, but still standing, still willing to follow wherever I might lead, and I understand that I am not leading them towards something. I am holding them together until they can become what they are meant to be: a free people, a nation. My job is not to be perfect, but to be present, to stand with them in their darkest hours as they stand with me in mine. The precedent maker. The day George Washington placed his hand on the Bible and took the oath of office as America's first president, he made a choice that would echo through history. The ceremony could have been grand and imperial. After all, many believed America needed to prove itself to European powers through displays of majesty and might. Instead, Washington chose simplicity. He wore a plain brown suit made of American cloth. He spoke the oath in a clear, steady voice that carried no hint of arrogance or ambition. When he was finished, he added 4 words that were not in the constitutional text: "So help me God." This was Washington's genius. He understood that in a nation founded on the rejection of kings, the president's power came not from ceremony or tradition, but from the consent of the governed. Every choice he made, every precedent he set, had to reinforce the fundamental truth that in America, the leader served the people, not the other way around. His first inaugural address was delivered to a joint session of Congress in Federal Hall, New York. The room was packed with men who had risked everything to create this new nation, and as Washington spoke, his voice slightly trembling with emotion, every person present understood that they were witnessing the birth of something unprecedented in human history. The preservation of the sacred fire of liberty and the destiny of the Republican model of government are justly considered as deeply, perhaps as finally, staked on the experiment and trusted in the hands of the American people, Washington told them. It was a remarkable statement, an acknowledgement that this entire experiment in self-government could fail, and that its success depended not on any one leader, but on the character and commitment of ordinary citizens. In the weeks and months that followed, Washington established precedents that would guide every president who came after him. He created the first cabinet, bringing together brilliant but often conflicting advisors like Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson. He established the tradition of the presidential tour, traveling throughout the new nation to see and be seen by the people he served. But perhaps most importantly, he established the precedent of restraint. When the Whiskey Rebellion erupted in western Pennsylvania in 1794, Washington faced his first domestic crisis as president. Farmers, angry about federal taxes on whiskey, had taken up arms against tax collectors and federal marshals. Many of Washington's advisors urged him to crush the rebellion with overwhelming force, to make an example that would discourage future resistance to federal authority. Washington chose a different path. He personally led a force of nearly 13,000 militiamen to western Pennsylvania, demonstrating that the federal government had the power to enforce its laws, but he also issued pardons to most of the rebels, showing mercy and seeking reconciliation rather than revenge. The farewell that shaped a nation. As George Washington prepared to leave the presidency in 1797, he faced one final test of leadership: how to leave office gracefully and in a way that would strengthen rather than weaken the institution he had helped create. Many of his supporters urged him to run for a 3rd term. He was still popular, still vigorous at 64, and many feared that without his steady hand, the young nation might fragment along partisan lines. But Washington had made up his mind years earlier. He would serve 2 terms and no more, establishing a precedent that would hold for nearly 150 years. His farewell address, published in newspapers across the country, was not just a goodbye. It was a father's final advice to his children. Written with Hamilton's help, but reflecting Washington's deepest convictions, the address warned against the dangers that could destroy the republic he had helped create. He warned against excessive partisanship. the alternate domination of one faction over another, sharpened by the spirit of revenge, natural to party dissension, which in different ages and countries has perpetrated the most horrid enormities, is itself a frightful despotism. He warned against permanent foreign alliances. It is our true policy to steer clear of permanent alliances with any portion of the foreign world, so far, I mean, as we are now at liberty to do it. Most importantly, he warned that the survival of American democracy depended not on any single leader or institution, but on the character and vigilance of its citizens. It is substantially true that virtue or morality is a necessary spring of popular government. On the morning of March 4, 1797, Washington stood on the steps of Congress Hall in Philadelphia and watched as John Adams took the oath of office as the second President of the United States. For the first time in human history, power was being transferred peacefully from one elected leader to another, without revolution, without bloodshed, without the involvement of armies or foreign powers. As Adams spoke the words of the oath, Washington felt something he had not felt in decades: relief. The burden was passing to younger shoulders, and the precedent was set. America would survive its founders. That evening, at a quiet dinner with Martha and a few close friends, Washington raised his glass in a toast. "To the American people," he said, "who have proven that free people can govern themselves wisely and well. The future is in their hands now, and I have faith, complete faith, that they will prove equal to the trust placed in them." The general's last battle. But Washington's story does not end with his departure from the presidency. In 1798, as tensions with France escalated toward what seemed like an inevitable war, President Adams called on his predecessor to once again take up the burden of military leadership. Washington was 66 years old, his body worn down by decades of public service, when he accepted appointment as Commanding General of the United States Army. It was a title he had never sought and hoped never to need again, but duty called, and Washington had never learned to say no to duty. The prospect of war with France divided the young nation more bitterly than any issue since independence. The Federalists, led by Hamilton, seemed eager for conflict. The Republicans, led by Jefferson, viewed the military buildup as a dangerous step toward militarism and monarchy. And caught in the middle was Washington, trying to prepare an army for a war that might never come, while preserving the civilian control of military power that was fundamental to American democracy. From Mount Vernon, Washington worked tirelessly to organize and equip forces that existed mostly on paper. He corresponded with officers, reviewed plans, and dealt with the constant political pressure from both parties to use his influence to support their positions. In letter after letter, Washington revealed his weariness with partisan politics and his growing concern that the bitter divisions between Federalists and Republicans might tear apart everything he had worked to build. "I was no party man myself," he wrote to a friend, "and the first wish of my heart was, if parties did exist, to reconcile them." The war with France never came. John Adams, showing considerable political courage, chose diplomacy over conflict, negotiating a peaceful resolution to the crisis. Washington's military preparations proved unnecessary, but his willingness to serve once more had provided the young nation with confidence and stability during a dangerous period. As 1799 drew to a close, Washington could finally allow himself to believe that his public service was truly finished. He was home at Mount Vernon, the place he loved most in the world, surrounded by the books, maps, and agricultural experiments that brought him more joy than any political office ever had. The final dawn. December 12, 1799, dawned cold and gray at Mount Vernon. George Washington, despite his 67 years, rode out as he did every morning to inspect his farms. The Potomac River was choppy under a leaden sky, and by afternoon, snow had begun to mix with rain.
He returned to the house late in the day, his clothes soaked through, but he would not delay dinner with guests waiting. He sat through the meal in his damp clothes, discussing politics and agriculture with the easy warmth that marked his private personality, so different from the formal dignity he had maintained through decades of public life. By the next morning, he was ill with a throat infection that would prove fatal. As he lay in bed, attended by Martha and their household staff, Washington faced his final test of character: how to die well. He refused treatments that might prolong his suffering, telling his physician, "Doctor, I die hard, but I am not afraid to go." He spent his last day settling his affairs, speaking kindly to all who served him, and asking Martha to bring him his 2 wills so he could destroy the one that did not provide for the eventual freedom of all their slaves. As evening approached on December 14, 1799, Washington called his secretary Tobias Lear to his bedside. His voice was weak but clear. "I am just going. Have me decently buried, and do not let my body be put into the vault in less than 3 days after I am dead. Do you understand me?"
Washington's last words were simple and characteristic. "'Tis well." At 10 o'clock that night, George Washington died peacefully in his own bed, surrounded by the people he loved most. Martha sat beside him, holding his hand, as the man who had carried the hopes of a nation for so long finally laid down his burden. The news of Washington's death spread across the country like wildfire. In cities and towns, in farmhouses and frontier cabins, Americans mourned the loss of the man they called the father of his country. But even in their grief, they could take pride in something remarkable. The nation Washington had helped create would survive his death. The precedents he had set, the institutions he had strengthened, the character he had demonstrated, all of these would endure. Napoleon Bonaparte, upon hearing of Washington's death, ordered 10 days of mourning throughout the French Empire. He said, "They wanted me to be another Washington, but they did not understand that such a man appears only once in 1,000 years." But Napoleon was wrong. Washington was not a once-in-a-millennium phenomenon. He was what America could create, an ordinary man made extraordinary by the depth of his commitment to something larger than himself. His greatness lay not in his perfection, for he was far from perfect, but in his recognition that true leadership meant serving others, even when that service required terrible sacrifices. As Martha Washington wrote to a friend in the days after her husband's death, "I cannot tell you how much I miss his daily presence, his gentle humor, his steady wisdom, but I can tell you this: he died as he lived, thinking not of himself, but of his duty to others. That is the greatest legacy any man can leave." The Scholar's Burden. John Adams, 1797 to 1801. The Man Who Stood Alone. The evening of March 4th, 1797, found John Adams sitting alone in his study, staring at a letter he could not bring himself to finish writing. Outside, Philadelphia celebrated the peaceful transfer of power from Washington to his successor. But inside the modest house on Market Street, America's second president grappled with a truth that would define his entire presidency. He was not George Washington, and no one would let him forget it. The letter was to his beloved wife Abigail, still back home in Massachusetts, and it began with words that revealed the depth of his anguish. "I have this day taken an oath which I fear I am not worthy to keep." How does one follow a legend? How does one lead when everyone wishes you were someone else? Adams crumpled the letter and threw it into the fire, watching the pages curl and blacken. He had spent his entire adult life preparing for this moment. Lawyer, revolutionary, diplomat, vice president, but nothing had prepared him for the peculiar loneliness of being the second choice for a job no one else really wanted him to have. At 61, Adams was already being dismissed by many as a caretaker president, someone to keep the seat warm until a more suitable candidate emerged. His own Federalist Party barely tolerated him, preferring the more charismatic Alexander Hamilton. The opposition Republicans made no secret of their belief that he was a would-be monarch dangerous to the very republic he had helped create. But John Adams had never cared much about what other people thought of him. He had built his entire career on the principle that unpopular truths were still truths, and that someone had to be willing to speak them, even when, especially when, no one wanted to hear them. The boy who questioned everything. To understand John Adams, we must travel back to a small farm in Braintree, Massachusetts, where a precocious boy spent his days asking questions that made the adults around him profoundly uncomfortable. Born in 1735 to a Puritan family of modest means, young John showed an early fascination with the law that bordered on obsession. While other children played games, John read legal treatises. While they explored the woods and fields around Braintree, John explored ideas, turning them over in his mind like smooth stones, examining them from every angle, challenging assumptions that everyone else simply accepted. His father, John Adams Sr., was a farmer and cobbler who recognized his son's intellectual gifts but worried about their practical value. "The boy thinks too much," he complained to his wife. "All those books and ideas, what good will they do him when it comes time to make a living?" But Susanna Adams saw something different in her son. She saw a mind that could not rest, could not accept simple answers to complex questions. She will never be satisfied with what is. She will always want to know why things are as they are, and whether they might be better. This restless intellect would define Adams throughout his life. At Harvard College, where he enrolled at 15, he quickly gained a reputation as the student who asked the hardest questions and gave the most unpopular answers. His professors admired his brilliance but worried about his arrogance. His classmates respected his intelligence but found him difficult to like. In his diary, a habit he would maintain for over 60 years, the young Adams revealed both his intellectual ambition and his painful self-awareness. "I am obnoxious, suspected, and unpopular. You must know this. But I cannot be other than I am. I must speak what I believe to be true, even if the truth makes me enemies." The lawyer's conscience. The Boston Massacre of March 5, 1770, presented John Adams with the defining choice of his early career. British soldiers, provoked by an angry crowd, had fired into a mob of colonists, killing 5 men. The entire city was in an uproar, demanding immediate justice and revenge. And then came the request that would have ruined a lesser man. The British soldiers asked Adams to defend them in court. Every practical consideration argued against accepting the case. Adams was a rising star in Boston's legal community with a growing practice and political ambitions. Defending the British soldiers would make him deeply unpopular with his neighbors and could destroy his career before it truly began. But Adams had built his life on a principle that was both simple and terrifyingly demanding. The law was the law, regardless of popular opinion or personal convenience. Every person, even British soldiers who had killed American colonists, deserved a fair trial and competent legal representation. He accepted the case. The trial became a masterpiece of legal reasoning and moral courage. Adams argued not that the soldiers were innocent, but that they had acted in self-defense when confronted by an armed and hostile mob. He presented evidence that the crowd had been throwing stones, sticks, and chunks of ice at the soldiers. He called witnesses who testified that the crowd had been shouting, "Kill them!" and "Fire, damn you, fire!" Most importantly, he reminded the jury of a principle that went to the heart of what America claimed to believe. "Facts are stubborn things," he told them, "and whatever may be our wishes, our inclinations, or the dictates of our passion, They cannot alter the state of facts and evidence. The jury acquitted 6 of the soldiers and found 2 guilty only of manslaughter. Adams had won, but at a tremendous personal cost. His law practice nearly collapsed. Former friends crossed the street to avoid him. He received threatening letters and found his house vandalized. But in his diary that night, Adams wrote words that revealed the depth of his conviction. "The law is the only thing that stands between civilization and chaos. Today I chose the law over popularity, principle over profit. I pray I have the strength to make such choices throughout my life, for they are the measure of a man's worth." The Revolutionary's Dilemma. By 1774, John Adams found himself in an impossible position. His defense of the British soldiers had marked him as a moderate in the eyes of many patriots, yet his growing opposition to British policies was making him suspect to loyalists. He was, as he put it in a letter to Abigail, a man without a country, too radical for the conservatives, too conservative for the radicals. But the calling of the First Continental Congress gave Adams a platform where his unique talents could shine. Here was a body that needed not firebrands, but thinkers, not speechmakers, but legal scholars who could construct careful arguments for American rights within the framework of British law. Adams threw himself into the work with characteristic intensity. He served on more committees than any other delegate, wrote more position papers, and worked longer hours than men half his age. His colleagues found him exhausting, but indispensable. A brilliant legal mind wrapped in an often prickly personality. It was Adams who made the crucial motion to appoint George Washington as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. It was a politically brilliant choice that helped unite the colonies behind the war effort. But it was also personally painful for Adams because he knew that Washington would receive the glory and adoration that Adams craved but could never achieve. "I am a man of words in an age that values deeds," he wrote to Abigail. History will remember Washington the general, Jefferson the writer of great phrases, Franklin the wise diplomat. But who will remember Adams the committee member, Adams the drafter of constitutions, Adams who did the hard, thankless work of building the machinery of government? The diplomat's sacrifice. In 1778, John Adams received what seemed like an honor but felt like an exile: appointment as America's diplomat to France. It meant leaving his family, his law practice, and his beloved Massachusetts for an indefinite period in a foreign country, trying to secure the aid that could mean the difference between American victory and defeat. The ocean crossing was harrowing. Adams's ship was nearly captured by British vessels twice, and he spent weeks wondering if he would ever see home again. But the real challenges began when he reached Paris and discovered that he was not America's only representative to France. Benjamin Franklin had already established himself as the colony's beloved ambassador, charming French society with his wit, his scientific achievements, and his carefully cultivated image as the simple American philosopher. Adams found himself relegated to a supporting role, and he hated every minute of it. He was temperamentally unsuited for the careful diplomacy that the French court required. Where Franklin used charm and indirection, Adams preferred direct argument. Where Franklin entertained at elaborate dinners and salons, Adams preferred to work alone in his study, drafting position papers and legal briefs. The tension between the two men became legendary in diplomatic circles. Franklin saw Adams as a rigid, humorless lawyer who didn't understand the art of persuasion. Adams saw Franklin as a superficial entertainer who cared more about his reputation than about American interests.
The trial became a masterpiece of legal reasoning and moral courage. Adams argued not that the soldiers were innocent, but that they had acted in self-defense when confronted by an armed and hostile mob. He presented evidence that the crowd had been throwing stones, sticks, and chunks of ice at the soldiers. He called witnesses who testified that the crowd had been shouting, "Kill them!" and "Fire! Damn you, fire!"
Most importantly, he reminded the jury of a principle that went to the heart of what America claimed to believe. Facts are stubborn things, he told them, and whatever may be our wishes, our inclinations, or the dictates of our passion, they cannot alter the state of facts and evidence. The jury acquitted 6 of the soldiers and found 2 guilty only of manslaughter. Adams had won, but at a tremendous personal cost. His law practice nearly collapsed. Former friends crossed the street to avoid him. He received threatening letters and found his house vandalized. But in his diary that night, Adams wrote words that revealed the depth of his conviction. "The law is the only thing that stands between civilization and chaos. Today I chose the law over popularity, principle over profit. I pray I have the strength to make such choices throughout my life, for they are the measure of a man's worth." The Revolutionary's Dilemma. By 1774, John Adams found himself in an impossible position. His defense of the British soldiers had marked him as a moderate in the eyes of many patriots, yet his growing opposition to British policies was making him suspect to loyalists. He was, as he put it in a letter to Abigail, a man without a country, too radical for the conservatives, too conservative for the radicals. But the calling of the First Continental Congress gave Adams a platform where his unique talents could shine. Here was a body that needed not firebrands but thinkers, not speechmakers but legal scholars who could construct careful arguments for American rights within the framework of British law. Adams threw himself into the work with characteristic intensity. He served on more committees than any other delegate, wrote more position papers, and worked longer hours than men half his age. His colleagues found him exhausting but indispensable, a brilliant legal mind wrapped in an often prickly personality. It was Adams who made the crucial motion to appoint George Washington as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. It was a politically brilliant choice that helped unite the colonies behind the war effort, but it was also personally painful for Adams. He knew that Washington would receive the glory and adoration that Adams craved, but could never achieve. "I am a man of words in an age that values deeds," he wrote to Abigail. "History will remember Washington the general, Jefferson the writer of great phrases, Franklin the wise diplomat. But who will remember Adams the committee member, Adams the drafter of constitutions, Adams who did the hard, thankless work of building the machinery of government?" The diplomat's sacrifice. In 1778, John Adams received what seemed like an honor but felt like an exile, appointment as America's diplomat to France. It meant leaving his family, his law practice, and his beloved Massachusetts for an indefinite period in a foreign country, trying to secure the aid that could mean the difference between American victory and defeat. The ocean crossing was harrowing. Adams's ship was nearly captured by British vessels twice, and he spent weeks wondering if he would ever see home again. But the real challenges began when he reached Paris and discovered that he was not America's only representative to France. Benjamin Franklin had already established himself as the colony's beloved ambassador, charming French society with his wit, his scientific achievements, and his carefully cultivated image as the simple American philosopher. Adams found himself relegated to a supporting role, and he hated every minute of it. He was temperamentally unsuited for the careful diplomacy that the French court required. Where Franklin used charm and indirection, Adams preferred direct argument. Where Franklin entertained at elaborate dinners and salons, Adams preferred to work alone in his study, drafting position papers and legal briefs. The tension between the two men became legendary in diplomatic circles. Franklin saw Adams as a rigid, humorless lawyer who didn't understand the art of persuasion. Adams saw Franklin as a superficial entertainer who cared more about his reputation than about American interests. But despite their personal animosity, both men were working toward the same goal: French support for American independence. And in 1783, when the Treaty of Paris was signed, ending the Revolutionary War and securing American independence, Adams could take pride in knowing that his careful legal work had helped create the framework for a lasting peace. In his diary that night, Adams reflected on the cost of his diplomatic service. "I have been away from home for 5 years, have missed watching my children grow up, have lived among people who find me strange and difficult. But tonight, America is free and independent, and I played a role in making that possible. Perhaps that is enough." The vice president's frustration. The election of 1789 presented Adams with a unique challenge. He received the second highest number of electoral votes, making him America's first vice president under a system that seemed designed to humiliate him. The Constitution gave the vice president exactly one job: to preside over the Senate and cast tie-breaking votes. Otherwise, he was, in Adams's memorable phrase, the most insignificant office that ever the invention of man contrived or his imagination conceived. For 8 years, Adams sat in the Senate chamber, listening to debates he could not join, watching legislation he had no power to influence, serving a president who rarely consulted him on matters of importance. It was a special kind of torture for a man who had spent his entire career at the center of great events. Adams tried to make the best of it. He cast more tie-breaking votes than any vice president in history, almost always supporting Washington's administration. He established precedents for the office that would last for decades. He used his position to study the workings of the new government, preparing himself for the day when he might have greater responsibilities. But privately, he chafed at his irrelevance. "I am vice president. In this, I am nothing, but I may be everything." It was a prescient observation. Adams was indeed preparing to be everything, to inherit the burden of the presidency at a time when the young nation faced its greatest challenges.
The president nobody wanted. The election of 1796 revealed the fault lines that were already dividing the young republic. Adams won the presidency by just 3 electoral votes over Thomas Jefferson, who became vice president under the original constitutional system. For the first time in American history, the president and vice president belonged to different political parties, a recipe for the kind of political dysfunction that the founders had hoped to avoid. Adams entered the presidency knowing that he had few true allies. The Federalists preferred Alexander Hamilton, who had tried to manipulate the election results to prevent Adams from winning. The Republicans saw him as a monarchist who threatened the very foundations of democratic government. Even his own cabinet, holdovers from Washington's administration, owed their primary loyalty to Hamilton rather than to their new president. But perhaps most challenging of all, Adams inherited a foreign policy crisis that threatened to plunge the young nation into a war it could not win. France, angry about American neutrality policies and the Jay Treaty with Britain, had begun seizing American ships and treating American diplomats with open contempt. The French Directory seemed determined to drag America into the European war on France's side, whether America wanted to participate or not. Adams's first instinct was to try diplomacy. Against the advice of Hamilton and many in his own party, he appointed a 3-man commission to negotiate with France. The mission seemed to offer hope for a peaceful resolution to the crisis. Then came news that would define Adams' presidency: the XYZ affair. The insult that almost started a war. In the autumn of 1797, Adams received dispatches from his diplomatic mission to France that left him literally shaking with rage. The French foreign minister, Charles Maurice de Talleyrand, had refused to meet with the American commissioners. Instead, he had sent 3 agents, identified in the dispatches only as X, Y, and Z, to deliver an ultimatum. France would negotiate with America only if the United States paid a substantial bribe, issued a public apology for President Adams's hostile speeches, and provided France with a large loan. It was an insult that cut to the very heart of American dignity and independence. The young republic, which had fought a revolution to escape the arbitrary demands of foreign powers, was being asked to pay tribute like some medieval vassal state. Adams faced an impossible choice. If he revealed the dispatches to Congress, it would almost certainly mean war with France, a war that America was poorly prepared to fight. If he kept them secret, he would be accused of weakness and appeasement by his political opponents. He chose to release the dispatches. The American reaction was explosive. "Millions for defense, but not 1 cent for tribute," became the rallying cry that echoed from New England to Georgia. Congress authorized the creation of a navy, approved funds for coastal fortifications, and began preparing for war. Adams found himself, for the first and only time in his presidency, genuinely popular with the American people. But popularity came with a price that Adams was reluctant to pay. The Federalist Party, led by Hamilton, saw the crisis as an opportunity to build a large standing army and establish closer ties with Britain. They pushed for an immediate declaration of war against France and began making military preparations that seemed designed more to suppress domestic opposition than to fight foreign enemies. Adams watched these developments with growing alarm. He had not fought one revolution against arbitrary power, only to see America develop its own form of militarism and authoritarianism. The Peacemaker's Courage. In February 1799, John Adams made what many considered the most courageous decision of his presidency, and what his political enemies called the greatest mistake. Without consulting his cabinet or congressional leaders, he announced that he was sending a new diplomatic mission to France to seek a peaceful resolution to the crisis. The reaction was swift and brutal. Hamilton and his supporters accused Adams of betraying American honor and undermining national security. Even members of Adams's own cabinet threatened to resign rather than support what they saw as a capitulation to French demands. But Adams had received intelligence that the political situation in France was changing. The Directory that had insulted American diplomats was losing power, and new leaders might be more willing to negotiate seriously with the United States. More importantly, Adams had concluded that war would be a disaster for the young republic, potentially destroying the democratic institutions that Washington and the founding generation had worked so hard to establish. "I will never send another ambassador to France," Adams had promised in the heat of the XYZ crisis, "without assurances that he will be received, respected, and honored as the representative of a great, free, powerful, and independent nation." Now, with those assurances in hand, Adams was willing to risk his political career on the possibility of peace. The new mission succeeded beyond Adams' wildest hopes. The Convention of 1800, signed in September, ended the quasi-war with France and restored normal diplomatic relations between the two nations. America had avoided a conflict that could have bankrupted the Treasury, strengthened federal power at the expense of individual rights, and potentially led to military dictatorship. But the political cost to Adams was enormous. The Federalist Party never forgave him for choosing peace over war, diplomacy over military glory. In the election of 1800, many Federalists refused to support their own incumbent president, contributing to his narrow defeat by Thomas Jefferson. The Alien and Sedition Crisis. While Adams was wrestling with the French crisis, his Federalist allies in Congress were pushing through legislation that would haunt his presidency and threaten the very foundations of American liberty. The Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798 gave the federal government unprecedented powers to deport immigrants and prosecute critics of the administration. The Sedition Act was particularly dangerous, making it a crime to publish false, scandalous, and malicious writing against the government or its officials. In practice, this meant that Republican newspaper editors who criticized Adams or his policies could be arrested, fined, and imprisoned. Adams found himself in an agonizing position. He had not requested the legislation and privately had doubts about its wisdom, but once it was passed, he felt obligated to enforce it, even as he watched it being used to silence legitimate political opposition. The prosecutions under the Sedition Act became a national scandal. Republican editors were dragged from their printing shops and thrown into federal prisons. One Vermont congressman was prosecuted for criticizing Adams in a letter to a newspaper. Even private citizens found themselves facing federal charges for making jokes about the president's appearance or policies. Adams later acknowledged that his failure to oppose the Alien and Sedition Acts more vigorously was one of the greatest regrets of his presidency. "I should have seen that the cure was worse than the disease," he wrote in retirement. "In trying to protect the government from its critics, we nearly destroyed the very freedoms that made it worth protecting." The crisis came to a head when the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, secretly authored by Jefferson and Madison, declared that states had the right to nullify federal laws they considered unconstitutional. For a moment, it seemed as though the Union itself might dissolve over the question of federal versus state power. Adams helped defuse the crisis by allowing the Alien and Sedition Acts to expire, and by pardoning most of those convicted under them. But the damage to his reputation was permanent. He would be remembered as the president who had signed legislation restricting freedom of speech and press, a legacy that would overshadow many of his genuine achievements.
The Midnight Judges. As Adams prepared to leave office in March 1801, he faced one final controversy that would have lasting consequences for American government. The lame duck Federalist Congress had passed the Judiciary Act of 1801, creating new federal judgeships and expanding federal court jurisdiction. Adams spent his final weeks in office, including his last night as president, appointing Federalists to these new positions. The Midnight Judges, as they became known, were Adams's attempt to ensure that Federalist principles would continue to influence American law even after Jefferson took office. The most important of these appointments was John Marshall as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Marshall, Adams's distant cousin and fellow Federalist, would serve for 34 years and establish many of the fundamental principles of American constitutional law. But the Midnight Judges also created a constitutional crisis. Jefferson and the Republicans saw the appointments as a last-minute power grab, an attempt to thwart the will of the people who had voted for change. They moved quickly to repeal the Judiciary Act and remove many of Adams' appointees from office. The controversy culminated in the landmark case of Marbury v. Madison, in which Chief Justice Marshall established the principle of judicial review, the power of federal courts to declare laws unconstitutional. It was a victory for Federalist constitutional theory, achieved through one of Adams's final presidential acts. The Peaceful Transfer. On the morning of March 4, 1801, John Adams rose early in the President's house, not yet called the White House, and quietly departed Washington before Jefferson's inauguration. He would be criticized for this apparent snub, but those who knew Adams understood that he was not being petulant, he was being characteristically direct. Adams had no desire to participate in the ceremony that would formalize his political defeat, but more than that, he wanted to make a point about the nature of American democracy. By leaving quietly, he was demonstrating that in America, power belonged not to individuals but to offices, and that the peaceful transfer of power required no ceremony or validation from the departing leader. The carriage ride back to Massachusetts gave Adams time to reflect on his presidency and its meaning. He had served during one of the most dangerous periods in American history, when war with France seemed inevitable, when the very survival of constitutional government was in doubt, when partisan divisions threatened to tear the young nation apart. He had made mistakes. The Alien and Sedition Acts would forever stain his record. He had made enemies. Hamilton and the High Federalists would never forgive him for choosing peace over war. He had failed to achieve many of his goals. His dream of a strong but limited federal government would die with his party's defeat. But he had also achieved something remarkable. He had preserved American independence during a global war, maintained constitutional government during a domestic crisis, and demonstrated that American democracy was strong enough to survive partisan conflict and the peaceful transfer of power. As his carriage rolled through the Pennsylvania countryside toward home, Adams wrote in his diary, "I have served my country as faithfully as my abilities allowed. I have made choices that were unpopular but necessary, stood for principles that cost me friends and influence. History will judge whether I was right, but my conscience is clear. I chose peace over war, law over popularity, principle over party. If that is not enough, then I am not the man I hoped to be." The Sage of Quincy. Adams lived for 25 years after leaving the presidency, longer than any ex-president before or since. From his home in Quincy, Massachusetts, he watched the nation he had helped create grow and change in ways he had not anticipated. He corresponded with Jefferson, renewing a friendship that had been broken by political differences. Their letters, spanning 14 years and covering topics from philosophy to agriculture to the meaning of the American Revolution,
became one of the great intellectual achievements of the early republic. "You and I," Adams wrote to Jefferson in 1813, "ought not to die before we have explained ourselves to each other." It was a remarkable statement from a man who had spent his political career being misunderstood and misrepresented. Adams also continued his lifelong habit of speaking uncomfortable truths. He warned against the growing influence of slavery in American politics, predicting that it would eventually tear the nation apart. He criticized the increasing democratization of American society, arguing that pure democracy was as dangerous as pure aristocracy. He defended the necessity of political parties while lamenting their tendency toward extremism and demagoguery. Most importantly, he reflected on the lessons of his own presidency and their meaning for future generations. "I have learned," he wrote in 1818, "that the presidency is not about being loved or even understood. It is about making the hard choices that no one else wants to make, standing for principles even when they are unpopular, and trusting that history will vindicate those who choose duty over convenience." The last words. On July 4, 1826, the 50th anniversary of American independence, John Adams lay dying in his bedroom in Quincy, Massachusetts. At 90 years old, he had outlived most of his contemporaries and witnessed the transformation of the small republic he had helped create into a continental power. As the day progressed, Adams drifted in and out of consciousness. His last words, witnessed by his family and recorded for posterity, were both poignant and prophetic. "Thomas Jefferson survives." He was wrong. Jefferson had died earlier that same day at Monticello, just a few hours before his old friend and rival. It was as if the two men who had done so much to create America and had spent their final years reconciling their differences could not bear to leave the world without each other. The news that both Adams and Jefferson had died on the anniversary of American independence sent shockwaves throughout the nation. It seemed impossible, almost supernatural, that the two men who had embodied the hopes and contradictions of the American experiment should die on the same day that celebrated its birth. But perhaps there was a deeper meaning to their simultaneous departure. Adams and Jefferson represented the two poles of American political thought, one emphasizing order and stability, the other emphasizing freedom and change. Their deaths on Independence Day seemed to suggest that America had matured enough to survive without the guidance of its founders, that the principles they had established were strong enough to endure on their own. John Adams was buried in a simple grave beside his beloved Abigail in Quincy. His tombstone bore a modest inscription that captured the essence of his life. John Adams, 2nd President of the United States, a man of integrity who served his country faithfully. It was not the elaborate monument that some presidents might have chosen, but it was perfectly suited to a man who had always valued substance over style, principle over popularity, duty over personal ambition. John Adams had lived and died as he had governed, without compromise, without pretense, without apology for being exactly who he was. The Philosopher's Dream, Thomas Jefferson, 1801 to 1809. The Contradictory Genius. Picture, if you will, a tall, lanky man with reddish hair and penetrating hazel eyes, sitting in his study at Monticello as the sun sets over the Virginia mountains. The year is 1800, and Thomas Jefferson has just been elected the third President of the United States after one of the most bitter campaigns in American history. The room around him tells the story of a mind that refuses to be confined by conventional boundaries. Books in 7 languages line the walls, philosophy next to architecture, poetry beside scientific treatises, political theory interspersed with agricultural manuals. A telescope stands by the window. Mechanical devices of his own invention clutter the desk. Architectural drawings are scattered across every surface. This is Thomas Jefferson, philosopher and politician, idealist and pragmatist, champion of liberty and owner of slaves. He contains within his single person all the contradictions and possibilities of the young American Republic.
its highest aspirations and its deepest failures, its revolutionary potential and its stubborn limitations. As he sits in the gathering darkness, preparing to assume the presidency, Jefferson understands that he faces a unique challenge. He must somehow bridge the gap between the America that exists, partisan, contentious, still finding its way, and the America he dreams of creating. A nation of independent farmers and free thinkers, governed by reason rather than passion, dedicated to the pursuit of happiness for all its citizens. The candle beside his desk flickers as he takes up his pen to write in the journal he has kept since his youth. Tonight's entry will be brief but prophetic. The revolution of 1800 begins not with the changing of parties, but with the changing of hearts. We have proven that a people can throw off their government peacefully, through ballots rather than bullets. Now we must prove that they can govern themselves wisely. The boy who built worlds. To understand Thomas Jefferson, we must journey back to Shadwell, a modest plantation in the Virginia Piedmont, where a curious boy spent his days exploring both the physical and intellectual landscapes that would shape his extraordinary life. Thomas was born in 1743 into a world that was both privileged and precarious. His father, Peter Jefferson, was a surveyor and mapmaker who had helped establish the boundaries of Virginia colony. His mother, Jane Randolph Jefferson, came from one of Virginia's most prominent families. But young Thomas was more interested in boundaries than in bloodlines, more fascinated by what lay beyond the horizon than by what his ancestry entitled him to claim. From his earliest years, Thomas showed an insatiable hunger for knowledge that set him apart from his contemporaries. While other planters' sons learned the basics of reading, writing, and accounts, Thomas devoured books on subjects that seemed to have no practical application to life on a Virginia plantation. He taught himself enough Latin to read Caesar and Cicero, enough Greek to puzzle through Homer, enough French to correspond with European philosophers. But his education was not confined to books. Peter Jefferson taught his son to survey land, to read the subtle signs that revealed a territory's potential for farming, settlement, or development. These early lessons in practical geography would prove invaluable decades later when President Jefferson would need to understand the vast territories he was adding to the American domain. The boy also learned to observe human nature with the same careful attention he paid to the natural world. Shadwell was home to dozens of enslaved Africans who performed the labor that made the Jefferson family's comfortable life possible. Young Thomas was surrounded by the fundamental contradiction that would torment him throughout his life. How could a society dedicated to liberty depend on the bondage of other human beings? In his later writings, Jefferson would remember these early years as formative. I learned to see the world as it was, not as I wished it to be. But I also learned to imagine how it might be different, how human reason and goodwill might overcome the accidents of birth and circumstance. That tension between what is and what ought to be became the driving force of my life. The Student's Awakening. When 16-year-old Thomas Jefferson arrived at the College of William and Mary in Williamsburg in 1760, he entered a world that would transform his understanding of what it meant to be human, to be American, and to be free. Williamsburg was the colonial capital of Virginia, a cosmopolitan center where planters' sons mixed with merchants, lawyers, and government officials. It was Jefferson's first real exposure to the intellectual currents that were beginning to challenge the traditional assumptions of colonial society. At William and Mary, Jefferson encountered professors who had been educated in Europe and who brought Enlightenment ideas about reason, natural rights, and human progress to their eager American students. Dr. William Small, Jefferson's philosophy professor, introduced him to the works of John Locke, David Hume, and other thinkers who argued that legitimate government must be based on the consent of the governed. But Jefferson's real education took place not in the classroom, but in the informal gatherings that Dr. Small organized for his most promising students. These dinner parties, held in his modest rooms, became Jefferson's introduction to the art of intellectual conversation. He learned to present his ideas clearly and persuasively, to listen carefully to opposing arguments, and to modify his positions based on new evidence and better reasoning. It was during one of these dinners that Jefferson first articulated the idea that would define his political philosophy:
If all men are created equal, then no man has a natural right to rule over another without that other's consent. Government must be an agreement among equals, not the imposition of one will upon many. Dr. Small's response was both encouraging and challenging. Young man, you have identified the central paradox of our time. We live in a society that proclaims the equality of man while practicing the subordination of some men to others. The question is not whether you are right in theory, but whether you are prepared to live with the practical consequences of your beliefs. Jefferson would spend the rest of his life wrestling with that challenge. The lawyer's conscience. After graduating from William and Mary, Jefferson read law with George Wythe, one of Virginia's most distinguished jurists and a man who would profoundly influence his understanding of how legal principles should serve human liberty. Wythe was not just a teacher of legal precedents and courtroom procedures. He was a philosopher of law who believed that the ultimate purpose of any legal system was to protect and expand human freedom. Under Wythe's guidance, Jefferson learned to see law not as a collection of arbitrary rules, but as humanity's attempt to create justice through reason and experience. The cases that came before Jefferson as a young lawyer often forced him to confront the contradictions in Virginia society. He defended runaway slaves whose only crime was seeking their freedom. He handled property disputes that turned on whether human beings could be legally owned and sold. He wrote wills for planters who wanted to free their slaves but were constrained by laws that made manumission difficult or impossible. Each case reinforced Jefferson's growing conviction that Virginia's legal system was fundamentally flawed, based on principles that contradicted the natural equality of human beings. In his private notes from this period, he wrote, "How can we practice law in a society whose laws are themselves unlawful? How can we seek justice through institutions that perpetuate injustice?" But Jefferson also discovered that the law could be a tool for gradual reform. He began writing legal briefs that challenged the foundations of slavery, arguing that Virginia's legal system should evolve to reflect more enlightened principles. He represented clients whose cases, while small in themselves, helped establish precedents that expanded the rights of free blacks and limited the power of slaveholders. His most famous case from this period involved a mixed-race man named Samuel Howell, who was suing for his freedom. Virginia law held that children followed the status of their mothers, so if Howell's grandmother had been a slave, he would be enslaved regardless of his father's race. But Jefferson argued that natural law superseded human law. Under the law of nature, all men are born free. Everyone comes into the world with a right to his own person, which includes the liberty of moving and using it at his own will. Jefferson lost the case, but his argument became part of the growing body of anti-slavery legal theory that would eventually help undermine the institution he was simultaneously challenging and participating in.
The Revolutionary's Pen. The summer of 1776 found Thomas Jefferson in a stifling room in Philadelphia, struggling with what would become the most important writing assignment in human history. The Continental Congress had appointed him to a 5-man committee charged with drafting a declaration explaining why the American colonies were breaking away from British rule. Jefferson later claimed that he tried to avoid the assignment, arguing that John Adams or Benjamin Franklin would be better choices. But his colleagues insisted, and Jefferson found himself alone with a blank piece of paper and the responsibility for putting into words the hopes and dreams of an entire people. The Declaration of Independence that emerged from Jefferson's pen over the next 17 days was unlike anything that had ever been written by a government. Instead of simply listing grievances against King George III, it began with a statement of fundamental principles. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These 35 words would reverberate through history, inspiring democratic movements around the world and forcing Americans to confront the gap between their ideals and their reality. Jefferson had created not just a justification for revolution, but a standard by which all future American institutions and policies would be judged. But even as he wrote these immortal words, Jefferson was acutely aware of their radical implications. If all men were truly created equal, what about the enslaved Africans who worked his plantation? If liberty was truly an unalienable right, how could any government permit one human being to own another? Jefferson included in his draft declaration a passionate denunciation of slavery, blaming King George III for forcing the slave trade on unwilling American colonists. But the Continental Congress, eager to maintain unity among the colonies, struck out these passages. Jefferson was forced to watch as his attempt to use the Declaration to challenge slavery was sacrificed to political necessity. In his autobiography, written decades later, Jefferson reflected on this moment. "I believed then, as I believe now, that the Declaration established principles that would eventually make slavery impossible in America. But I also learned that even the most beautiful words are powerless if people are not ready to live by them." The Governor's Trial. The British invasion of Virginia in 1781 presented Jefferson with the greatest crisis of his early political career. As governor of the state, he was responsible for organizing resistance to an enemy force that seemed unstoppable and infinitely better equipped than the ragtag militia units under his command. The situation was desperate. British forces under Benedict Arnold and later Lord Cornwallis moved through Virginia almost at will, burning plantations, freeing slaves, and forcing the state government to flee repeatedly from one temporary capital to another. Jefferson found himself governing a state that was largely under enemy occupation. Worse yet, Jefferson discovered that his philosophical commitment to limited government was poorly suited to the demands of wartime leadership. He was reluctant to use authoritarian measures that might save Virginia but would violate the democratic principles he held dear. He refused to impose martial law, to confiscate private property for military use, or to compel military service from unwilling citizens. The result was a military disaster. Virginia's defenses collapsed, and Jefferson was forced to flee Monticello just hours before British cavalry arrived to capture him. He ended his term as governor, having presided over what many considered the most humiliating defeat in Virginia's history. The Virginia legislature launched an investigation into Jefferson's conduct as governor, and for months it seemed possible that his political career might be over before it had truly begun. Jefferson was devastated, writing to friends that he had been made a victim of the jealousy and malice of my enemies. But gradually, as the full facts became known, Jefferson was vindicated. The investigation concluded that he had acted honorably and competently under impossible circumstances. His real fault was not cowardice or incompetence, but an excess of democratic scruples that prevented him from taking the strong measures that wartime required. The experience taught Jefferson valuable lessons about the relationship between principles and practical governance. He learned that sometimes leaders must make decisions that compromise their ideals in order to preserve the institutions that make those ideals possible. It was a lesson that would serve him well during his presidency, when he would face similar conflicts between his philosophy and the demands of leadership.
The diplomat's education. Jefferson's appointment as minister to France in 1784 came at a crucial moment in his intellectual development. At 41, he was still forming his ideas about politics, economics, and human nature. His 5 years in Europe would expose him to ideas and experiences that would profoundly shape his presidency 2 decades later. Paris, in the 1780s, was the intellectual capital of the world, home to philosophers, scientists, and artists who were challenging every assumption about how society should be organized. Jefferson threw himself into this ferment of ideas with characteristic enthusiasm, attending salons, visiting scientific academies, and engaging in lengthy correspondences with European intellectuals. He was particularly drawn to the French philosophers, who shared his belief in human reason and natural rights. He became close friends with the Marquis de Lafayette, who had served under Washington during the American Revolution and was now working to bring democratic reforms to France. He corresponded with Voltaire about religious tolerance, with Condorcet about the possibility of human progress, with Buffon about natural history. But Jefferson's European experience also exposed him to the dark side of aristocratic society. He saw how extreme inequality corrupted both the wealthy and the poor, how the concentration of land ownership created both desperate poverty and wasteful luxury. He visited England and witnessed the early stages of industrial development, with its growing cities, its factory system, and its masses of displaced agricultural workers. These observations convinced Jefferson that America must choose a different path. Rather than following Europe toward industry and urbanization, America should remain a nation of independent farmers.
Rather than accepting the European model of class-based society, America should work to ensure that every citizen had access to land and the economic independence that came with it. "Were I to indulge my own theory," he wrote to John Jay from Paris, "I should wish Americans to practice neither commerce nor navigation, but to stand with respect to Europe precisely on the footing of China. We should thus avoid wars, and all our citizens would be husbandmen." It was a vision that would guide Jefferson's domestic policies throughout his presidency. An America of small farmers, minimal government, and maximum individual liberty. The Secretary's Dilemma. When Jefferson returned from France in 1789 to serve as Secretary of State in Washington's administration, he found an America that had changed dramatically during his absence. The new Constitution had created a stronger federal government, and Alexander Hamilton's financial program was transforming the country's economic structure. Jefferson was deeply troubled by what he saw. Hamilton's plan to assume state debts, establish a national bank, and encourage manufacturing seemed designed to create the very kind of aristocratic commercial society that Jefferson had seen and deplored in Europe. Even worse, Hamilton appeared to be using federal power to benefit speculators and merchants at the expense of farmers and ordinary citizens. The conflict between Jefferson and Hamilton became the defining feature of Washington's second term and established the pattern of partisan division that would dominate American politics for decades to come. On the surface, it was a debate about specific policies, banking, taxation, foreign relations, but at a deeper level, it was a fundamental disagreement about what kind of nation America should become. Hamilton envisioned an America that would rival European powers in wealth and military strength, a commercial and industrial nation with a strong central government capable of competing in the international system. Jefferson dreamed of an America that would transcend European models, a decentralized republic of independent farmers who would govern themselves through democratic institutions. The two men fought their battles in cabinet meetings, in private letters, and increasingly in the partisan newspapers that sprang up to support their competing visions. Jefferson found himself in the uncomfortable position of serving an administration whose policies he fundamentally opposed. The breaking point came over American policy toward the French Revolution. Jefferson saw the French uprising as a continuation of the American Revolution, a further step in humanity's progress toward freedom and democracy. Hamilton viewed it as dangerous radicalism that threatened property rights and social stability. When war broke out between France and Britain, Jefferson favored supporting America's former ally. Hamilton insisted on neutrality that tilted toward Britain. Washington ultimately sided with Hamilton, issuing a neutrality proclamation that Jefferson believed betrayed America's revolutionary principles. Unable to reconcile his principles with his position, Jefferson resigned from the cabinet in 1793. But his conflict with Hamilton had established him as the leader of the emerging Republican Party and the spokesman for Americans who feared that the revolution was being betrayed by the very government it had created.
The Revolution of 1800. The election of 1800 was unlike anything America had experienced before. For the first time, the stakes seemed to involve not just which party would control government, but whether American democracy would survive at all. The Federalists, led by John Adams and Alexander Hamilton, portrayed Jefferson as a dangerous radical who would destroy religion, property rights, and social order. They warned that a Jefferson presidency would lead to mob rule, atheism, and alliance with a revolutionary France. The Republicans, rallying around Jefferson, depicted Adams and the Federalists as crypto-monarchists who were systematically destroying American liberty. They pointed to the Alien and Sedition Acts as evidence that the Federalists were willing to use federal power to silence their critics and establish authoritarian rule. The campaign was vicious even by modern standards. Federalist newspapers claimed that Jefferson was an atheist who would confiscate Bibles and close churches. Republican editors accused Adams of planning to establish a hereditary monarchy and marry one of his sons to the daughter of King George III. When the electoral votes were counted, Jefferson and his running mate Aaron Burr each received 73 votes, while Adams received 65. Under the Constitution, tied elections were decided by the House of Representatives, with each state delegation casting one vote.
But the House was controlled by Federalists who had to choose between Jefferson, whom they hated, and Burr, whom they distrusted. For 6 days and 35 ballots, the election remained deadlocked. Rumors spread that Jefferson's supporters were preparing to march on Washington if he were denied the presidency. Some Federalists suggested that they should simply refuse to choose anyone, leaving the country without a president. Finally, Alexander Hamilton intervened. Despite his personal animosity toward Jefferson, Hamilton recognized that Burr was completely unprincipled and would be a disaster as president. Hamilton used his influence with Federalist congressmen to ensure Jefferson's election on the 36th ballot. Jefferson understood the significance of what had just happened. For the first time in history, political power had been transferred peacefully from one party to another through purely democratic means. In his inaugural address, he called it the Revolution of 1800 and pledged to heal the divisions that had brought the country to the brink of civil conflict. "We are all Republicans, we are all Federalists," Jefferson declared, attempting to restore unity to a badly divided nation. It was a noble sentiment, but it would prove easier to say than to implement. The President's Vision. Jefferson entered the presidency with a clear vision of what he wanted to accomplish. He would reverse the Federalist drift toward big government and restore America to its founding principles of limited federal power and maximum individual liberty. His inaugural address, delivered on March 4, 1801, outlined what he called the essential principles of our government: equal and exact justice to all men, peace and honest friendship with all nations, support for state governments as the most competent administrations for our domestic concerns, preservation of the federal government in its whole constitutional vigor, and economy in the public expense that labor may be lightly burdened. Jefferson began implementing these principles immediately. He pardoned all those convicted under the Sedition Act and allowed the act itself to expire. He reduced the size of the Army and Navy, arguing that America's geographic isolation made large military forces unnecessary. He eliminated many federal taxes, including the hated whiskey tax that had provoked armed resistance during Washington's presidency. Most symbolically, Jefferson abandoned the formal etiquette that had characterized the Washington and Adams administrations. He received visitors in casual clothes, hosted informal dinners instead of state receptions, and walked rather than rode in carriages. He was trying to demonstrate that American democracy was fundamentally different from European aristocracy. But Jefferson quickly discovered that governing according to strict philosophical principles was more difficult than he had anticipated. The federal government that he inherited had responsibilities and commitments that could not simply be wished away. The Barbary pirates were demanding tribute from American merchant ships. European powers were threatening American neutral rights. The Western territories needed roads, courts, and military protection. Most challenging of all, Jefferson found himself confronting an opportunity that would test every principle he claimed to hold dear: the chance to purchase the Louisiana Territory from France.
The Louisiana Contradiction. In 1803, Jefferson faced the greatest crisis of conscience of his presidency. Napoleon Bonaparte, needing cash to finance his European wars, had offered to sell the entire Louisiana Territory to the United States for $15 million. The opportunity was breathtaking. The Louisiana Purchase would double the size of the United States, ensure American control of the Mississippi River, and provide land for Jefferson's dream of an agrarian republic. It would guarantee that America could expand westward for generations without coming into conflict with European powers. But there was one enormous problem. Jefferson could find no provision in the Constitution that authorized the federal government to acquire new territory. As a strict constructionist who had spent years arguing that the federal government should possess only those powers explicitly granted by the Constitution, he was being asked to approve the largest expansion of federal power in American history. Jefferson agonized over the decision for weeks. He drafted constitutional amendments that would have provided legal authority for the purchase, but his advisors warned him that the delay might cause Napoleon to change his mind. Finally, Jefferson made a choice that revealed the pragmatic politician beneath the philosophical idealist.
He submitted the treaty to the Senate and argued that the power to acquire territory was implied by the Constitution's provisions for making treaties and admitting new states. It was a decision that haunted Jefferson for the rest of his life. He had violated his own constitutional principles to serve what he saw as the greater good of the American people. In private letters, he admitted his discomfort. "I have done an act beyond the Constitution, but it is an act that will benefit our country for generations to come, and I trust that the people will approve a measure taken for their good, even if the means were questionable." The Senate ratified the treaty by a vote of 24-7, and Jefferson signed it into law on October 20, 1803. With the stroke of his pen, he had added 828,000 square miles to the United States and ensured that his vision of an agrarian republic would have room to grow. But the Louisiana Purchase also raised troubling questions about the future of slavery. Would the peculiar institution be allowed to expand into these new territories? Jefferson hoped that the vast expanse of the West would allow slavery to be gradually phased out as it became economically obsolete. Instead, the question of slavery's expansion would become the defining issue of American politics for the next 60 years, ultimately leading to the Civil War that Jefferson had hoped to avoid. The embargo's failure. By 1807, Jefferson found himself caught in the same trap that had ensnared his predecessors: how to maintain American neutrality while Britain and France waged total war against each other. Both European powers were seizing American ships and impressing American sailors. The British, desperate to maintain their naval supremacy, were stopping American vessels on the high seas and forcing American citizens to serve in the Royal Navy. The French, trying to break Britain's economic stranglehold on Europe, were confiscating any American ship that traded with British ports. Jefferson's response was characteristically idealistic. Rather than going to war, America would simply stop trading with both belligerents. The Embargo Act of 1807 prohibited all American ships from leaving American ports for foreign destinations. Jefferson believed that Britain and France, deprived of American goods and markets, would be forced to respect American rights. It was an experiment in what Jefferson called peaceable coercion, the idea that economic pressure could accomplish what military force could not. If successful, it would vindicate Jefferson's vision of America as a different kind of nation, one that could defend its interests without resorting to the violence that had plagued European civilization for centuries. Instead, the embargo became a disaster that nearly destroyed Jefferson's presidency and the Republican Party. American merchants, sailors, and farmers found themselves ruined by a policy that prevented them from earning a living. New England, heavily dependent on overseas trade, experienced a severe economic depression. Smuggling became rampant as Americans ignored federal law to resume trading with Britain and Canada. Worse yet, the embargo had no effect on European policy. Britain and France continued their maritime warfare, largely ignoring the absence of American ships from international waters. Jefferson had succeeded only in punishing Americans while leaving the original problems unsolved. The political cost was enormous. In the election of 1808, the Federalists made their first significant gains since 1800, winning control of several state governments and coming close to defeating Jefferson's chosen successor, James Madison. Jefferson was forced to sign a repeal of the embargo just days before leaving office, admitting that his grand experiment in peaceful coercion had failed. In his final weeks as president, Jefferson reflected bitterly on the gap between his ideals and reality. "I believed that reason and economic interest would triumph over pride and prejudice. I was wrong. The world is not yet ready for the kind of enlightened policy that America tried to pursue." The philosophers' retreat. On March 4, 1809, Jefferson rode away from Washington with a sense of relief that he had rarely felt in his long public career. At 65, he was finally free to return to the pursuits that had always given him the greatest satisfaction: learning, building, farming, and thinking. Monticello, the mountaintop home that Jefferson had been designing and redesigning for 40 decades, became his laboratory for exploring the relationship between architecture and human happiness. He spent hours each day supervising construction projects, experimenting with new building techniques, and incorporating the latest scientific innovations into his domestic arrangements. But Jefferson's retirement was not a retreat from public life so much as a different kind of engagement with the world. He began planning the University of Virginia, which he envisioned as a new kind of educational institution, one based on reason rather than religious doctrine, one that would prepare citizens for self-government rather than subjection to authority. The university became Jefferson's greatest achievement, the practical embodiment of his philosophical beliefs about human potential and democratic education. He designed not just the buildings, but the entire curriculum, recruiting faculty from Europe and America who shared his vision of education as the foundation of free society. If a nation expects to be ignorant and free in a state of civilization, it expects what never was and never will be, Jefferson wrote in 1816. The University of Virginia was his attempt to ensure that Americans would be neither ignorant nor enslaved.
The Correspondence of Giants. Perhaps the most remarkable chapter of Jefferson's retirement was his reconciliation with John Adams. The two men who had worked together during the Revolution, served together in diplomatic posts, and then become bitter political enemies during the 1790s began corresponding again in 1812 at the urging of mutual friends. Their letters, which continued until both men died in 1826, became one of the great intellectual achievements of American history. Over 14 years they exchanged thoughts on philosophy, religion, politics, and the meaning of the American experiment. Despite their political differences, they found that they shared fundamental beliefs about human nature, the importance of education, and the ultimate destiny of Republican government. "You and I ought not to die before we have explained ourselves to each other," Adams wrote in one of his early letters to Jefferson. It was a generous gesture from a man who had been deeply hurt by their political battles, and Jefferson responded with equal grace. The correspondence revealed both men at their best, Adams with his wit and intellectual honesty, Jefferson with his optimism and philosophical depth. They argued about the nature of democracy, the role of religion in society, and the lessons of their shared experience in creating a new nation. Most movingly, they reflected on their own mortality and the legacy they would leave to future generations. "I regret that I am now to die in the belief that the useless sacrifice of themselves by the generation of 1776 to acquire self-government and happiness to their country is to be thrown away by the unwise and unworthy passions of their sons," Adams wrote in 1819, expressing his concern about the growing sectional divisions over slavery. Jefferson shared Adams' concerns, but maintained his characteristic optimism about humanity's long-term progress toward freedom and enlightenment. He wrote, "I steer my bark with hope in the head, leaving fear astern. My hopes indeed sometimes fail, but not oftener than the forebodings of the gloomy." The sage's wisdom. During his final years, Jefferson became something of an oracle for Americans seeking to understand the meaning and direction of their democratic experiment. Visitors from across the nation and around the world made pilgrimages to Monticello to hear the sage of the Blue Ridge reflect on politics, philosophy, and human nature. He used these encounters to refine and express his mature thinking about the challenges facing American democracy. He warned against the concentration of wealth and power, predicting that economic inequality would eventually threaten political equality. He urged continued westward expansion as a safety valve that would prevent the kind of class conflicts that plagued European societies. Most importantly, he continued to grapple with the contradiction that had tormented him throughout his life.
How could a nation founded on the principle of human equality continue to tolerate slavery? Jefferson knew that slavery was wrong. He called it holding a fire bell in the night. But he could never bring himself to take the personal and political risks necessary to challenge it effectively. His attitude toward slavery in old age was a mixture of guilt, rationalization, and genuine perplexity. He continued to believe that blacks and whites could not live together as equals in American society, and he supported colonization schemes that would have gradually freed slaves and transported them to Africa. But he also recognized that such schemes were impractical, and that slavery was likely to continue for the foreseeable future. "We have the wolf by the ears," he wrote about slavery in 1820, "and we can neither hold him nor safely let him go. Justice is in one scale, and self-preservation in the other." The patriarch's burden. Jefferson's final years were overshadowed by financial difficulties that threatened to destroy everything he had spent his life building. His generous hospitality, his ambitious building projects, and his habit of endorsing loans for friends had left him deeply in debt. The Panic of 1819 made his situation even worse by reducing the value of his land and making credit almost impossible to obtain. Facing the possibility that Monticello might have to be sold to pay his creditors, Jefferson launched a desperate campaign to raise money through a public lottery. The idea that the author of the Declaration of Independence might die in poverty sparked a national fundraising effort that ultimately provided enough money to keep Monticello in the family. But the financial crisis forced Jefferson to confront the ultimate contradiction of his life. He would have to sell human beings to pay his debts. In 1826, just months before his death, Jefferson authorized the sale of more than 130 enslaved people from his various plantations. It was a decision that violated everything he claimed to believe about human equality and natural rights, but he saw no alternative that would allow his family to survive financially. The sale of his slaves haunted his final months. He had spent his entire life arguing that all men were created equal, but when forced to choose between his principles and his family's economic security, he chose his family. It was a choice that revealed both his humanity and his moral limitations.
The prophet's vision. Despite his personal struggles and contradictions, Jefferson never lost faith in the ultimate triumph of human reason and democratic government. In his final letter, written just 10 days before his death, he expressed his confidence that the American experiment would eventually spread throughout the world. "May it be to the world what I believe it will be, to some parts sooner, to others later, but finally to all, the signal of arousing men to burst the chains under which monkish ignorance and superstition had persuaded them to bind themselves, and to assume the blessings and security of self-government." Jefferson died at Monticello on July 4, 1826, exactly 50 years after the adoption of the Declaration of Independence. His last words, according to his physician, were, "James Madison, the architect of balance. Imagine a Virginia evening where the air is thick with the scent of honeysuckle and the distant hum of crickets. A small man sits in a study at Montpelier, his plantation home, surrounded by books that glow in the candlelight. This is James Madison, born in 1751, frail in body but vast in mind. His eyes, sharp and thoughtful, trace the pages of Locke and Montesquieu, their words sparking like flint in his thoughts. The world outside is alive with the rustle of leaves, but Madison's heart beats for ideas, ideas that could build a nation to last." Madison grew up in a Virginia of rolling hills and tobacco fields, where the British Crown's shadow loomed large. As a boy, he was quiet, often ill, but his mind was a furnace. Picture him at 12, curled up in a wooden chair, reading by firelight, his fingers smudged with ink. He loved history, philosophy, the clash of ideas. At Princeton, then called the College of New Jersey, he studied with a hunger that startled his teachers. Imagine him in 1771, debating liberty in a dim lecture hall, his voice soft but unyielding, his classmates leaning in to catch every word. He graduated in 2 years, burning through books, his body weak but his spirit fierce. The American Revolution was Madison's awakening. At 25, he served in Virginia's legislature, his pen crafting laws while others wielded muskets. Picture him in Williamsburg, the air heavy with tobacco smoke and tension as delegates argued over independence. He was no soldier, his health forbade it, but his mind was a weapon. In 1787, at 36, he arrived in Philadelphia for the Constitutional Convention. The city was a cauldron of heat and ideas, the summer air thick with sweat and ink. Delegates clashed, their voices rising in Independence Hall, a room of oak and ambition. Madison sat quietly, his notes meticulous, his thoughts racing. He proposed a government of checks and balances, a structure to tame power without strangling freedom. Picture his quill moving, his hand cramped, his heart pounding with the weight of the task. The Constitution, signed that September, was his masterpiece, a blueprint for a nation, fragile but enduring. The Bill of Rights was Madison's promise to the people. Imagine him in 1789, now a congressman, drafting amendments in a New York boarding house. The room smells of candle wax and parchment, the city's clamor faint through the window. He wrote to protect speech, faith, the press, rights he believed were the soul of liberty. Feel the weight of his words, each clause a shield against tyranny. He faced skeptics, those who feared too much freedom, but Madison stood firm, his voice steady, his logic unshakable. The amendments passed, a gift to a nation still learning to trust itself. When Madison became the 4th president in 1809, at 58, the world was a storm. Britain and France were at war, their navies preying on American ships. Picture him in the White House, then called the President's House, its walls still raw, the air chilly with unfinished dreams. His wife Dolly was his partner, her warmth a contrast to his reserve. She hosted gatherings, her laughter filling rooms, her gowns bright against the plain plaster. But tension loomed. The British seized American sailors, impressing them into service. Madison's heart ached for peace, but his mind knew war was coming. The War of 1812, declared in June, was his crucible. Picture the nation divided, New England merchants cursing the war, frontier settlers cheering it. Madison, small and spectacled, stood at the helm, his voice drowned by shouts of dissent. In 1814, the British invaded Washington, D.C. Imagine the chaos, smoke rising, cannons booming, the sky red with fire. Dolly saved a portrait of Washington as the White House burned, her hands steady, her courage a beacon. Madison fled to Virginia, his heart heavy with failure. Yet he rallied. The war ended in 1815 with the Treaty of Ghent, and the Battle of New Orleans, fought after the treaty, became a symbol of resilience. Picture the celebration, the air alive with cheers, Madison's quiet relief as he stood among his people. Madison retired to Montpelier in 1817, his days filled with reflection. Imagine him walking his fields, his steps slow, his cane tapping the earth. He wrote letters, tended his gardens, and wrestled with slavery's shadow. Like Jefferson, he owned slaves, a contradiction that gnawed at him. Imagine him in his study, reading abolitionist pamphlets, his mind torn between his world and his ideals. He died in 36, the last of the Founding Fathers, his body frail, but his legacy strong. What is a nation's foundation, dear listener? A document? A dream? Or the will to balance power and hope? Madison's life whispers to us. To build is to compromise. To endure is to adapt.
James Monroe, the keeper of peace. Now, let the scene shift to a Virginia meadow, where the grass sways under a summer sky and the air hums with the scent of wildflowers. A young man stands here, his boots scuffed, his eyes bright with dreams of adventure. This is James Monroe, born in 1758 in Westmoreland County, a son of the frontier. His home was modest, the wood creaking under winter winds, the fields small but fertile. Picture him at 16, running through the woods, his laughter echoing, his heart unburdened. But the Revolution changed him. At 18, he joined the Continental Army, his musket heavy, his courage untested. Imagine the Battle of Trenton, 1776, the snow thick and biting. Monroe, barely a man, crossed the Delaware with Washington, the river's ice cracking under their boats. The Hessians fired, the air sharp with gunpowder. A bullet tore through Monroe's shoulder, his blood staining the snow, his breath ragged but defiant. Picture him carried to a field hospital, the pain searing, yet his spirit unbroken. He survived, his wound a badge of sacrifice, his heart now bound to the cause of liberty. Monroe's path led from battlefields to diplomacy. In the 1780s, he studied law under Jefferson, his mentor's ideas sinking deep. Picture them at Monticello, the air warm with summer, discussing republics over wine. Monroe became a diplomat, serving in France during its revolution. Imagine Paris in 1794, the streets alive with chaos, the guillotine shadow looming. Monroe negotiated with revolutionaries, his voice calm, his mind sharp. He saw liberty's promise and its perils, his heart torn between admiration and caution. As the fifth president in 1817, Monroe inherited a nation healing from war. The era of good feelings began, a time of unity, however fleeting. Picture Washington, D.C., its streets muddy but bustling, the capital rising from ashes. Monroe traveled the country, the first president to do so since Washington. Imagine him in Boston, the harbor sparkling, crowds cheering a Virginian in Yankee land. He sought to bind the nation, to soothe its divisions. The Mississippi River became a lifeline, steamboats chugging through its waters, their whistles a song of progress. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 was Monroe's test. Slavery's shadow grew, dividing North and South. Picture him in the White House, maps and letters spread before him, his advisors arguing. He signed the compromise, admitting Missouri as a slave state and Maine as free, preserving balance but not peace. His heart ached, knowing the issue would fester. The Monroe Doctrine, declared in 1823, was his boldest stroke. Imagine him at his desk, the candle flickering, his words warning Europe, "The Americas are ours." It was a young nation claiming its place, its voice steady but untested. Monroe retired to Virginia, his days quiet but reflective. Picture him walking his estate, Oak Hill, the air sweet with clover, his wife Elizabeth beside him. He faced poverty, his years of service leaving him little wealth. He died in 1831, in New York, far from his Virginia fields, his body weary, but his legacy one of stability. What does it mean to keep peace, dear listener? To hold the nation's future like fragile glass, knowing one misstep could shatter it. Monroe's quiet resolve teaches us that peace is a choice, renewed each day.
John Quincy Adams, The Scholar's Burden. Drift now to a different world, where a boy stands on a Paris street, his small hands clutching a book, his eyes wide with wonder. This is John Quincy Adams, born in 1767 in Braintree, Massachusetts, the son of John and Abigail Adams. Picture him at 11, in 1778, sailing to Europe with his father, the sea vast and churning, the air sharp with salt. He watched revolutions unfold, first America's, then France's. His mind a sponge, soaking up languages, ideas, and dreams. He spoke French, Dutch, Latin, his voice soft but precise, his heart tethered to a distant America. As a young man, Adams was a diplomat, his life a tapestry of courts and treaties. Imagine him in St. Petersburg in 1809, the Russian winter biting, his breath visible as he negotiated trade. He was lonely, far from his wife Louisa, yet driven by duty. Picture his letters to her, written by candlelight, the ink smudged with longing. He served as Secretary of State under Monroe, his mind shaping the Monroe Doctrine, his pen carving America's place in the world. As the sixth president in 1825, Adams dreamed of progress, a nation of roads, canals, and schools. Picture him in the White House, his study lit by a single lamp, his plans sprawling across his desk. He wanted observatories, universities, a connected America. But politics were bitter, his rivals relentless. The election of 1824, called the corrupt bargain, left him wounded, his legitimacy questioned. Imagine him pacing, the floorboards creaking, his heart heavy with doubt. Congress blocked his visions, their voices loud with partisan venom. He served one term, losing re-election in 1828, his dreams unfulfilled. Yet, Adams's story did not end. Picture him in 1831 returning to Congress, an ex-president among lawmakers. The House chamber was hot, the air thick with debate. He fought slavery, his voice trembling but fierce, his body aging but his spirit young. Imagine him in 1841 defending the Amistad captives, his words a plea for justice. He collapsed in the House in 1848, his heart giving out, his legacy one of persistence. What is legacy, dear listener? A title or the courage to fight on, even when the world turns away? Adams's life whispers to us, duty is a fire that burns beyond power.
Andrew Jackson, the storm of the people. Finally, imagine a frontier, wild and untamed, where the air smells of pine and gunpowder. Andrew Jackson, born in 1767 in the Carolinas, was a child of hardship, his life scarred by loss. His father died before his birth, his mother and brothers taken by war. Picture him at 13, a revolutionary prisoner, his face bruised, his heart hardened. He grew up fast, a duelist, a lawyer, his temper a storm. Imagine him in Tennessee, his boots muddy, his voice rallying men to fight. The Battle of New Orleans in 1815 was Jackson's triumph. Picture the Mississippi's banks, the air thick with smoke, the roar of cannons. He led a ragtag army, farmers, pirates, native allies, to victory against the British, his horse galloping, his sword gleaming. The nation called him a hero, his name a rallying cry. But Jackson was no saint. His wars against native tribes were brutal, his victories stained with blood. As the seventh president in 1829, Jackson was the people's champion. Picture Washington, D.C., its streets alive with crowds, their cheers raw and hopeful. He expanded voting rights, giving voice to the common man. But his Indian Removal Act of 1830 brought tragedy. Imagine the Trail of Tears, the Cherokee marching, their steps heavy, their homes left behind. The air was thick with dust and sorrow, a wound that lingers. Jackson's heart was with his people, but his vision was narrow, his legacy a paradox. He fought the Bank of the United States, seeing it as a tool of the elite. Picture him in the White House, his desk cluttered, his voice fierce as he vetoed the bank's charter. The economy faltered, his gamble costly. He retired in 1837, his body worn, his spirit defiant. He died in 1845 at the Hermitage, his Tennessee home, the air sweet with magnolia. What is strength, dear listener? To rise, to err, to leave echoes for better or worse.
Jackson's storm reminds us that power is a double-edged sword. Epilogue: A Nation's Heartbeat. As we close, picture America in 1837. Its fields stretching, its dreams growing. These four men, Madison's balance, Monroe's peace, Adams' wisdom, Jackson's storm, wove a nation's story. They were human, flawed, yet their steps shaped our world. Sleep now, dear listener. Dream of a young country, of courage and candlelight. What will you carry into tomorrow?